We're talking with Peter Brown and Stephen Gaines, are the authors of The Love You Make. It's an insider story of the Beatles. And Peter, of course, was involved with the Beatles from the beginning to the end, and still remains friends with the remaining Beatles today. We were talking during the break about the fact that when John Lennon was murdered, the media immediately went out and got a hold of the other Beatles to ask them what the reaction was. And Paul is the guy that said something like, well, those things happen. It was real cold kind of sound.
It's interesting, particularly with somebody who was so public relations minded, somebody who's so articulate and so good at saying the right thing. I think that the reason for that was, with Paul, was that the emotion was so great there that he found it embarrassing to say anything. His feelings, instinctively, he closed up. And I think it was very difficult for him to say anything properly. It did come over very badly, I agree with you.
Were they still friends?
Not particularly good friends, but I mean, it was like the situation of brothers, that you might disagree for a while, you might even not speak for a while, but you'd always have that bond of brotherhood.
Peter and I were at Paul and Linda's house in the countryside. They live in a very little, simple house and none of the trappings of the rock star. And we were there for the weekend when one of John's last interviews in Newsweek came out, which he said some very mean things about Paul. This was shortly before his death, and Paul was very hurt about it, and Linda, they didn't understand why John had to keep on going on about it.
Mm-hmm. Probably the most startling fact in your book is that the Brian Epstein relationship with John.
Yeah.
That he was a homosexual, Brian was, and John and he did have a relationship at one time?
Well, it was, I don't know, it was the relationship was, Brian was very attracted to John right from the beginning, when he first saw him in the cabin playing, and everyone was aware of it, everyone knew about it, except Brian didn't think that they did. And John wasn't offended by it. In fact, he liked the idea of Brian being their manager, because he knew that he could continue to influence the destiny of the group through his influence over Brian.
He used it to control Brian, is what he did, John. He used his attraction.
And the relationship, the friendship blossomed, and eventually they went on holiday together, and that's when some of this consummation happened, but it was just a one-off thing.
It was a one-night thing. I don't think, I mean, everybody makes it into an affair, and it certainly was an affair. It was a one-night thing. John was an artist when he was younger. He was a great experimenter. He was a great seeker. He tried all sorts of things, and I don't find that such a shocking revelation in the book, although a lot of people do. I mean, I think John and Yoko's heroin addiction is something that's more surprising to me to find out, to learn that, or that George Harrison slept with Ringo's wife. The thing with John and Brian doesn't seem that surprising in light that this is...
You figure the whole fact the Beatles were the Beatles, a one-of-a-kind thing to ever happen, probably will never happen again, and those things don't sound that surprising. I mean, they're interesting to read about.
We see it on Dynasty. I mean,
that's the whole point. It's the thing about that Paul one time had one girl in one hotel room and another girl in another hotel room.
And the same suite.
In the same
just
suite.
different rooms.
Different bedrooms.
And he would switch
He
from
ran
one room
across
to the other.
the suite. Yes, go to one room.
Was this after or before a concert?
No, this was actually, this is in Los Angeles during a record convention, a record sales convention.
Oh, so he was kind of rested up.
Beverly Hills Hotel, right.
Had to stand around just sell records.
They were healthy young men,
Yeah, I think the point is that they're like any rock and roll group.
Sure.
They were, and we've built them up to be, these chaste, very, very special, people. The book the book doesn't tear them down at all. The book just reveals that they were regular people, like you and me. And nothing goes on in the book that doesn't go on in any suburb of any great American city.
Anymore. Nowadays, I mean, maybe back in the 60s it was
Not in Glendale.
No. A lot of people say Yoko broke up the band.
Well, that's a gross oversimplification. I mean, Yoko certainly brought a lot of changes to John, which inevitably influenced what happened to the group. John was very unhappy for many years until he met Yoko. Yoko brought a great change in his life. She showed him that he didn't have to continue being a Beatle. And there were other things in life besides this thing that he thought he was trapped in.
See, instead of the blame, I think Yoko really deserves credit, because she said, there are more opportunities you have if you feel that you've become a plastic pop idol, which is what John thought, and John was afraid he was going to end up playing a lounge in Las Vegas. She said, break away, become an artist, become a politician. Take my hand, John, I'll be with you. And that's something John never had his whole life. So actually, it's more of an inspiring story than saying she just broke up the Beatles.
However, we didn't see it that way at the time.
No.
I think that's interesting
as
that
music
Peter
fans,
can look back and remember how angry they all were with Yoko at the time, and yet now see it as something more positive.
What about Ringo, the drummer, that's been with the Beatles for so many years? You point out that a lot of his drum tracks were
in the later
overdubbed.
days, the more sophisticated the music became, the more difficulty Ringo had with it. And Paul, who had been now taught himself to play the piano, taught himself to play drums and a lot of other instruments too, really wanted to get to the drums himself. And in many cases where it was his own songs, he overdubbed Ringo's tracks after Ringo went home. And when Ringo found out about this, obviously he was very hurt and upset.
Who was the most brilliant of the four of them?
Brilliant, I suppose John,
Hard to say. I
unquestionably.
guess John as an all-around thing. I think Paul writes the best melodies. You know, one of the great composers of this time. I think he's a very important composer. But I think as a thinker, it was John.
Do you think they'd ever gotten back together?
No.
Never would.
The last, I discussed this with the Beatles themselves, was when the Secretary General of the United Nations asked me to talk to them about doing a benefit concert for the Vietnamese boat people. And I discussed it with them, knowing what the answer would be, only because of where the question was coming from. And John says, it's so naive to think that we could do that. I mean, it's too far, too much has happened, we can't go back.
I think the Beatles, in a certain way, are like Santa Claus to us. You know, there's a point in our growing up when somebody came along and said, listen, it's not Santa Claus, it's Uncle Harry dressed up in a costume, and, you know, your parents pay for the gifts. And we didn't want to hear that, but I think part of our growing up and part of the Beatles growing up was helping us to write this book.
How's the outlook changed between the three remaining Beatles towards each other since John's death?
Well, I mean, they were always kept pretty good contact with each other, although George, you know, and Ringo were always a little bitter about the way they were treated during while the group was in the life of the group. They felt that they were treated less than equal citizens. But I mean, now that the group has broken up and that they're all living their separate lives, there's a friendship there. They all turned up for Ringo's wedding.
They did? Mm-hmm. What wife number is he at now?
Oh, there are two.
Just two.
Yeah.
Just two. Yeah, they haven't been married a lot, you know.
Well, it was John was married twice.
They also all played together, by the way, at Patty Harrison, the ex-Mrs. Harrison. George's first wife married Eric Clapton, who was in love with her for so many years, as we explain in the book. And when she finally married Eric Clapton, the three Beatles showed up at the wedding, and they all played together. They played old favorites like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and things like that.
That'd be something.
That would have been a wonderful thing to have seen, right?
Yeah. You ever get surprised when you hear stories about kids calling radio stations now and asking, and I've had this happen to a friend of mine, it's a disc jockey. He got a call from a girl and says, "Was that really true? Paul McCartney was one of the Beatles?"
Yeah, was he in a group before Wings?
Yeah. And it happened. Right. Thank you so much. Good luck for the book. Let me go back. I'm going to bring it back here.
Yeah.
Believe me, after 2 days, I'm not going to be wheeling all over this set. There it is. The Love You Make. Thank you very much.